By the third week, they were eating the horses. Not because anyone wanted to, because there was nothing else left. The 26th Cavalry, one of the last mounted units in the entire United States Army, watched their own commander give the order: slaughter the horses, feed the men. These were animals soldiers had ridden into battle days earlier. Now they were dinner. And here's the part that doesn't make sense yet. This wasn't even the worst meal these men would eat. Not close. Within weeks, the horses would be gone too. And what came after the horses is something almost nobody outside the Philippines has ever been told properly.
Most of these men were not professional soldiers. They were Filipino reservists, farmers, fishermen, teenagers who had finished basic training weeks earlier and never fired a weapon outside a drill. Some of them had volunteered for one specific reason. They had been told, promised, that when this war ended, the Philippines would finally be independent, free. So when Japan invaded in December 1941, these untrained men picked up rifles anyway. Not because they were ready, because they believed what they were fighting for was worth it. They had no idea what the next 99 days would actually cost them.
December 8, 1941. 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, Japan hit the Philippines too. Within a month, Manila had fallen. General Douglas MacArthur made a decision. Retreat. Pull every soldier, every refugee, every supply truck into a single peninsula. Bataan, 30 miles long, 15 miles wide. A wall of jungle and mountain that could be defended, in theory, far longer than open ground. But here's what MacArthur didn't account for. 26,000 civilian refugees followed the army into Bataan, which meant the food meant for 80,000 fighting men now had to feed over 100,000 people. The math was already broken before the first shot of the siege was fired.
January 6, 1942. The siege officially began, and almost immediately the order came down. Half rations. Cut everyone's food in half. Effective immediately. Richard Gordon, a corporal who survived what was coming, remembered it simply. There was a little resentment, he said, but I don't think anyone expected anything terrible to happen as a result of rations being cut in half. He was wrong. Terrible was exactly what was coming. They just didn't know it yet. Half rations was the beginning, not the bottom.
By late January, hunger had company. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, tropical diseases that thrive on exactly one thing: bodies too weak and too malnourished to fight back. There was no air cover, no naval support, no reinforcements coming, and every soldier on that peninsula knew it. Frank Hewitt, a war correspondent trapped there with them, wrote a line that spread through the camp like a second disease: and nobody gives a damn. That's not bitterness. That's what it feels like to realize the world has already moved on, while you're still fighting for your life in it.
By February, the menu had changed completely. Monkeys, dogs, cats, carabao, the water buffalo Filipino farmers had used for generations to plow their fields, eaten. Edwin Ramsey, a cavalry lieutenant, remembered it without flinching decades later. We ate anything we could get our hands on. By March, there weren't any animals left to eat, not in that part of the peninsula. Filipino farmers, with almost nothing themselves, still gave starving soldiers their last chickens, their last rice. In the middle of a siege, strangers were still finding ways to give each other what little they had left.
And through all of it, the fighting never stopped. Lester Tenney, a tank battalion soldier, described it years later in a single sentence that says everything. There was no time during the morning, noon, or night that there was not a gunshot. Machine guns firing so continuously the barrels would curve from the heat. Imagine that. Metal bending, not from age, from use. These men were starving, sick, exhausted, and still somehow, still fighting hard enough to bend steel. Japan had expected to take Bataan in 50 days.
50 days. That was Japan's entire battle plan. 50 days to take the peninsula, 50 days to break American and Filipino resistance, 50 days before moving on to their next target. It did not take 50 days. It took 99. Nearly double what Japan's own military command had planned for. Imperial headquarters back in Tokyo grew furious at the delay, furious that a force of exhausted, starving, half-trained men was holding up an empire's timetable. That delay mattered. It bought time. Time the rest of the Pacific desperately needed. But time was the only thing Bataan had left to give.
By April 3rd, 1942, fresh Japanese forces arrived. Reinforcements originally meant for a different invasion entirely, redirected straight into Bataan. The exhausted defenders had nothing left to match it. No reserves, no fresh troops, no food reserves to call on. Just men who hadn't eaten properly in 3 months, facing an enemy that had just been resupplied. On April 8th, MacArthur, from the safety of Australia, where he'd been ordered to evacuate weeks earlier, sent one final order back to Bataan: do not surrender. The man giving that order was no longer the man who would have to obey it.
Major General Edward King received that order. Do not surrender. And King looked at his men, a third of them sick or wounded, all of them starving, all of them out of ammunition, out of food, out of anything resembling a fighting chance. King made a decision that would follow him the rest of his life. He disobeyed a direct order from Douglas MacArthur. On April 9th, 1942, King surrendered. 78,000 men, 66,000 of them Filipino, 12,000 American. The largest force ever surrendered under American command in history. King chose his men's lives over his orders. He would later say it was the right decision. What happened next would make him question that for the rest of his life.
From a tunnel on the island of Corregidor, a radio broadcast went out that day. The voice of freedom. Bataan has fallen, the broadcast said. The Philippine-American troops on this war-ravaged and blood-stained peninsula have laid down their arms, with heads bloody but unbowed. Listen to that phrase again. Bloody but unbowed. Not bloody and defeated. Bloody but unbowed. Whoever wrote those words understood something that mattered. Surrendering and being broken are not the same thing. These men had run out of options. They had not run out of dignity.
Here's something most people don't know. The Japanese military had not planned for this many prisoners. Their 50-day timeline assumed a much smaller force, captured much faster. 78,000 men was not in their plan. No food stockpiled for that many prisoners. No water,
no medical supplies, no transport vehicles prepared. So the Japanese commanders made a decision. If there's no way to transport this many men, they walk, all 65 miles, in tropical heat exceeding 100 degrees. Men who hadn't eaten properly in 3 months were about to be asked to walk the distance of more than 2 marathons. The march began on April 9th, 1942, the same day they surrendered. No rest, no recovery. Straight from the battlefield onto the road. The Japanese military followed a code called Bushido, a code that held surrender itself was shameful, which meant, in the eyes of their captors, these men were not prisoners of war. They were cowards, to be treated as less than human. Within the first day, men who collapsed from exhaustion were bayoneted where they fell. Men who stopped to drink from a roadside puddle, often contaminated, sometimes containing the bodies of those who died there before them, were shot for breaking formation.
The march lasted between 5 and 10 days, depending on where along the route a man joined it. No food was provided, no water, except what they could find or steal along the way. Beheadings happened, documented, verified, witnessed by survivors who carried those images for the rest of their lives. Roughly 2,500 Filipinos and 500 Americans died during the march itself. Not from old age, not from illness alone, from a 65-mile walk that should never have been a death sentence and became one anyway.
Those who survived the march arrived at Camp O'Donnell, a former Filipino training base. A Japanese officer greeted them with 5 words. "You are guests of the Emperor. We will work you to death." That wasn't a threat. It was a plan. The camp diet was a watery rice gruel called lugao, containing fish heads, vegetables, and often inch-long weevils. An additional 26,000 Filipinos and 1,500 Americans died at that camp. Not on the march, after it. The dying did not stop when the walking did. For over a year, the outside world had no idea any of this had happened. No reports, no confirmation. Families in the Philippines and in America simply didn't know. Then, in April 1943, 10 Americans and 2 Filipinos escaped from a different camp entirely, Davao. They became known as the Davao Dozen, and when they reached safety, they told their story, in full. For the first time, America learned what had actually happened on that road. The truth had been walking 65 miles in the heat for over a year before anyone outside the Philippines heard a word of it.
Here's the part that recontextualizes everything you just heard. Bataan fell. 78,000 men surrendered. Thousands died on a death march afterward. By every traditional measure, this was a defeat. But Imperial Japan's master plan for the entire Pacific assumed Bataan would fall in 50 days. It took 99. That 49-day delay rippled through Japan's entire war machine. Every other invasion scheduled after Bataan got pushed back, delayed, disrupted. The men who starved on that peninsula didn't know it at the time, but they were buying time for a war they would not live to see the end of.
In 1944, 2.5 years later, Douglas MacArthur kept the promise he made when he left. "I shall return." He did. American and Filipino forces retook the Philippines. Manila was liberated in early 1945. The men who survived the camps were freed. And for a moment, it felt like the story had an ending, like the sacrifice had been honored. But there is a second part to this story.
a part involving promises made to these soldiers about what they would receive for everything they had endured. America did not keep that promise either.
66,000 Filipino soldiers surrendered at Bataan, most of them reservists, farmers, teenagers, men who joined an army with no formal training because they believed in a promise of independence. They ate their horses, then their dogs, then there was nothing left to eat at all. They watched friends die on a 65-mile road for the crime of being too exhausted to keep walking. And they did all of it for a country that had not yet decided whether they deserved to be remembered for it.
There is a memorial in New Mexico. Every year, people walk 8.5 miles in tribute to what happened on that road in 1942. One of them, Colonel Ben Scarden, walked it every single year until he was 101 years old. He survived the march. He survived the camps. He survived hell ships to Japan. He came home, became a teacher, and for the rest of his life, he kept walking that distance so people would not forget. Most of the men who marched beside him never got that chance. And in just a moment, you'll understand why some of them never got something else either. Something America promised them and never delivered.